The Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology at Sapsucker Woods is one of the Ithaca community's unique treasures, as well as a sparkling jewel in the university's crown. Who doesn't enjoy a peaceful stroll along the lab's trails to calm one's mind? The lab is world-renowned for its science as well as its outreach focused on birds. Its science-based educational materials uh, are godsends to K through 12 educators and amateur ornithologists alike. Some of you, in fact, may have Merlin on your cell phone. That is an app that the lab produced, and it's free to all use it. With Merlin, you can identify birds by their songs. Now today's speaker. John Fitzpatrick became the lab's director in 1995. He succeeded Charlie Walcott, who set the science straight at the lab and set the table for Fitz, so to speak. When Fitz came, building the new laboratory was his first priority and mission. Supported by the lab's administrative staff and the university, he oversaw the design, construction, and development of the new lab. It opened in 2003 and has become the premier center for the study of birds and biodiversity, probably for the world. The lab very much reflects Fitz's far-sighted vision, extraordinary ambition, and unrelenting drive for excellence. He's also a great evangelist for the birds. If Sapsucker Woods is a bird sanctuary, then the lab is its cathedral. In 1990, 5 years before Fitz arrived, Cornell's late great Carl Sagan pondered a color photograph of planet Earth made by NASA's space probe Voyager 1, on which Carl Sagan worked. Sagan was so moved by that image that he wrote, and I quote, "In terms of life in the universe, Earth, this pale blue dot, is all there is. Earth is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves." Today, almost 35 years later, John Fitzpatrick will comment on the prospects for life on Earth as foretold by the birds around us, and how this knowledge might hopefully save us from ourselves. And with that, Fitz, it's a pleasure to welcome you.
All right. Anyway, thank you very much, Ron. I appreciate the invitation from Cape. It's been a long time since Charlie Walcott invited me to do the same sometime back in the post-Pleistocene era. And I appreciate your inviting me here. I very much appreciate the Kendalls accommodating us here as well. And we're really great to see a bunch of very good longtime friends here in the audience. My goal today is to run through a series of stories, hopefully getting out of here by the hour, but I am particularly excited about talking about things that are going on at the lab that have been evolving through my time there and are continuing to evolve to this day. I'll be showing you a few things that are very recent, sort of hot off the press or heading to the press, and commenting a bit in terms of what birds are doing as communicators about planet-wide issues. I'm putting that little thing in there to remind you that I brought hot off the press some annual reports from the Lab of Ornithology. Those of you who are members and supporters, you get this in the mail. It is possible that there are a few of you who have overlooked the opportunity to be members of the lab. And for you particularly, I think you'd be interested in looking through this remarkable, very recent annual report of a sampling of the bouquet of projects and people that are going on at this incredible place. Well, one of the features of the lab is, I think most of you know, is that we have the world's biggest repository of animal sound recordings and videos and now images, nearly 70 million images of birds now, and counting by the day. I grabbed one of the cut of, or a series of cuts from a project we did a few years ago with partners in Argentina. I just want to show you that you don't need to know anything at all about birds be to be damn glad we get to live in a planet that has them, right? So just sort of take some of this in here. No secret what's going on here. These are a couple of birds who are sizing each other up, making sure that they're in sync with each other, and working on it if they get out of sync to convince themselves that, yes, they can do this tango. That's the male with a slightly larger crest, that guy there. There they go. There they go. Oops. So these like many other birds with complex courtship displays, are not by any means one-trick ponies. Watch this little number. Now, here you are. Now nod if you love me. So you just don't need to know anything about birds to appreciate the fact that we're on a planet that has something like this that you can enjoy and appreciate. Now let me tell you the story of this amazing critter. This is the hooded grebe, and it wasn't known to Western humanity and science until 1974, when a group of Argentine students, led by their professor, went up to the highest lakes in southern Argentina and discovered, lo and behold, a previously unknown to science monotypic grebe. How crazy is that? Restricted after a few years of work, they found, to a series of lakes in the very highest elevations of Argentina, where they winter down there in just a couple of spots at the estuaries of a few still undammed rivers. Let's hope that continues, but it's being threatened right now. In 1974, the estimate after the first discovery was that there were about 5,000 of these individuals. The most recent comprehensive survey of the same areas in 2015 showed us that there were only about 500. The bird was going steadily down during this intervening time as a consequence of mainly a consequence of introduced mink, of course, from North American and European mink farms, and also the introduction of these monster rainbow trout, which of course supply a lot of Argentine economy for people who go fly fishing down there, but they do a number on the natural features of the lake. The mink is being fairly well controlled, and the numbers are continuing to decline of this grebe, but they're still very precarious. And I bring this up in part to reflect on the fact that this grebe is most closely related to a widespread European grebe that is distributed across Asia, Africa, Southeast Asia, Australia, and even New Zealand, where it became the bird of the year last year. This is the closest relative of this little endemic in Argentina. And what does that tell us? It reflects the fact that grebes are ancient. The origin of grebes goes back 40 million years. And indeed, the closest living relative of the grebes is shown in this fairly recent evolutionary tree of the birds. The closest living relative nobody can guess. So I'll just tell you that it's the flamingos. So flamingos and grebes are not at all related to ducks. They're not at all related to loons. They're related to flamingos. And they've been evolving for 40 million years. And at some point during the breakup of the continents, as they separated Eurasia on the one hand and the Western Hemisphere on the other, this little grebe got caught in the Andes and evolved and placed there. So it has an ancient history, and I bring that up because we reflect, thank goodness that the Louvre has glass over the front of the Mona Lisa, because as you know, it's subject to a lot of vandalism and lots of angry displays. But we invest huge amounts of money globally in the great works of art, from the minuscule sculptures of 2,000 years ago to the great Renaissance artists, to the cathedrals of the mosques and synagogues of the world. We invest, as we should, the protection of these fantastic things that reflect the human culture. And yet, to this day, I continue to be asked why it matters to be protecting things like this, that have vastly more history and contain vastly more information than any one piece of art like the Mona Lisa, which was, let's face it, created only a couple hundred years ago, where we're looking at creatures like this on their way out of the planet that have been here for tens of millions of years, accumulating information, teaching us things about the natural history of this planet. So from my standpoint, when we talk about the value of biodiversity, the very first thing I talk about is not their economic value and so on. It is the fact that we get to live side by side with this. Carl Sagan's comments being absolutely apropos. We're the only place known that has this privilege. And we have a huge responsibility to think about that privilege and the time frame in which those things spent evolving. Well, birds are nature's best communicators about this concept to us. Birds are amazing. I group their powers. The birds have multiple powers. I group the powers into 4 categories, every one of which supplies enormous opportunities for us as human beings. Number 1, they are fantastic models for how nature works, how nature has changed through time. They have been the subject of science since Aristotle's day. And to this very day, they continue to teach us fundamental principles about nature. They are also extremely sensitive, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, to environmental change. And so in that respect, globally, they're distributed in every part of the planet. They represent great environmental barometers. As things change, the bird populations change, we can get a proxy for how things are going by paying attention to these bird populations, and we'll get back to that in a second. Thirdly, another point that I'll give you a couple of demos on in a second, they are by the billions, literally, moving across the planet twice a year. In this context, they are literally the heartbeats of the Earth's annual cycle. And by measuring how those heartbeats are changing, we get real information about how the state of the world is going. And finally, and probably in my mind most important, they sing to us. They draw us into nature. They are the voice of nature. They are the characters that make us love nature, that make every culture in the world revere nature. It's no accident that poets and playwrights and songwriters since the Greeks have used birds, have involved birds, have engaged birds in their symbolisms and in their stories, because they appeal to the emotional, spiritual, aesthetic side of our brains, as well as the intellectual side of our brains. No other organism in the world does it this effectively, stimulating even simultaneously both sides of our brain. Well, okay, obviously for these reasons, as the decades have gone by, and we've gotten better and better at actually counting how they're doing, we're now actually concerned about observations like this multiple authored thing led by some lab of ornithology scientists, showing that as of 2019, over the last 50 years, we've lost about a third, almost a third of the North American breeding bird fauna just in the last 50 years. So there's a major decline underway. That paper illustrated the fact that it was actually true of almost every kind of bird living in every kind of habitat. So it's a general phenomenon, not just limited to a couple of types of birds. The only line that you see that's horizontal and slightly increasing up there are the water birds, particularly the waterfowl. And no surprise, since the 1930s, we've invested hundreds of millions of dollars across North America in the saving of the places where these birds depend. So if you invest in it, they will stay, they will procreate. And the question is, can we treat birds like we treat ducks? That's a standing question for the next half century, frankly. Well, we thought about this as a North American phenomenon. Only a year or two later, the Europeans published a very similar paper relating to the status of the birds of Europe and Asia. And it was with enormous concern that over the last couple of years, we started to see papers from our colleagues working in tropical, untouched tropical communities in South America showing staggering losses of birds in otherwise seemingly completely pristine parts of the Amazon and the Central American rainforests. That's the general picture of two different plots at this Tiputini biological reserve in Amazonian Ecuador. And this decline, very interestingly and importantly, this decline is most pronounced in the several different kinds of birds that feed on insects. So you see canopy living tropical birds. You see this ant thrush that I have a picture of here, which is an abundant bird across the Amazon basin, gone from Tiputini now. And the ant following birds and so on. So the insectivorous birds in particular in the Amazon, in the most pristine parts of the Amazon, are showing these kinds of declines. And this same result has now come out of a major long-term study in central Brazil and near Manaus and in Panama, in the canal zone of Panama. What's going on? We don't know. But something's going on that's a systemic issue. And we're going to have a hypothesis about it in a few minutes. I want to come back to the North American story and just tell you a fun story about how some of that work was done by some of our colleagues. A former physicist who's now an ecologist at the Lab of Ornithology, Adrian Doctor, played a major role in this. What you're seeing here is I think it's 140 dots on the map. Those are the NICS radar stations that provide your evening news with their weather forecasts. I'm showing you now those things on one particular night in which the light up at those stations was not weather, but it was birds. And we were able to actually spline those together and produce a nightly map of what the birds in flight densities look like across the United States, thanks to the NexRad system. And I'm going to show you a little video of what the spring migration, what the NexRad radar tells us about the spring migration across the United States looks like. And as things get brighter, you'll see the density of birds increase. As the density increases, things get brighter on this map. The circles here show you the approximate numbers. The arrows show that they're all basically moving north. This happens every spring. Remember I said by the billions, right? Every single spring, and then in the fall, it comes in reverse. Well, the NexRad radars, we have information from every single day since 1995, and night since 1995. Most of these birds migrate at night. So by putting all of that information together from across the whole US, we can actually count, literally, the movement of birds coming north in the spring. In this case, that particular year, 3.5 billion birds moved across into the US. 2.5 or so moved up into Canada to breed across that big boreal breeding zone. In the fall, 4 billion, of course, they made babies. So 4 billion birds coming back down into the US and 4.5 billion birds heading back to the tropics. So every year we can now begin to produce a cycle here in which we're counting how the entire continental bird population is doing. This is done by an amazing group of really smart people that are now diaspora across various universities around the country. They've created a way for you to enjoy this. If you haven't done this yet, go to Birdcast. I just a couple of days ago pulled up the Birdcast map for the prediction of how many birds would fly over the US that particular night. This was, I think, the 15th of October, a couple of days ago. That was the prediction around 2 in the afternoon for what the nighttime would produce. Now I'm going to show you, I went back in yesterday and said, okay, how'd they do? So we look at the actual observed distribution of birds at one particular moment, that is at midnight, that same night. And you can see how spectacularly well the prediction is borne out by the actual data from NextRad. So they have an automated system now that is literally predictive, just as accurate as the weather forecasts 2 to 3 to 5 days out are today. That, it turns out, by the way, there was one day last year that they finally crossed 1 billion in one night. This was the moment on the 6th, 7th October 23 when more than 1 billion birds were airborne at one time over the US. Where were they flying over? They were flying over a huge number of them flying over the central part of the US, in which from space you can see at night it looks like this. And we know from a number of studies now that nighttime light is actually interruptive of bird migration. And so the fact that we can now predict which nights are going to be big where across the continent allows us to actually think about giving the warnings to the cities that are going to be most affected by it. We have got a little video from Andrew Farnsworth, one of our lead aeroecologists.
It's just globally amazing. So every year, there are billions of birds migrating across the Americas every spring, and most of this movement happens at night. Big data sets tell us a diversity of species are migrating from the places where they've spent the winter in tropical South America, in Mexico, maybe parts of the Caribbean, depending, to the areas that they're going to breed. So the boreal forests of Canada, the prairie wetlands, even other spots within the U.S., in some cases the eastern deciduous forests or areas of the Intermountain West. All of these places connect through Texas. 1 out of every 3 birds that's migrating in the U.S. every year passes through Texas. Just enormous numbers of birds.
A consequence of the fact that Texas has the kind of ground sense of Times Square for these migrating nocturnal birds. We've been working with cities in Texas, particularly Houston and Dallas, but also the city of Chicago, the city of New York, Philadelphia, to expand the lights out idea where actual warnings come out for the given nights they're going to be particularly big for the movement of birds across their cities. And we would like to think that this is going to begin to reduce the total impact of bird collisions on buildings over time that may be contributing, almost certainly is contributing to that decline that we see of songbirds. So we have lights out campaigns underway. We are also trying to penetrate the huge growing emerging industry of wind farms because we can clearly give wind farms operational details on which nights of the year, if they stop the blades from 9 p.m. until 5 a.m., they could reduce, we think, as much as 80 or 90% of the impacts of these wind farms on migrating wildlife. So with the NextRad radar system, they thought they were creating it for weather. We now understand that they're really creating it for a much broader set of things that impact our natural world. I think most of you know that the Lab of Ornithology has been involved with getting citizens engaged in thinking about birds for a long time. We have access to a phenomenal every 5-year data set that shows us that over the course of the last few decades, the habit of watching birds and wildlife has actually been pretty big, and it's been growing, steadily growing through the 2000s and 2010s. COVID pandemic spectacularly increased the number of people who are paying attention to wildlife and birds in general. More than half of our adults are paying attention to birds in some meaningful way. And I want to just say that in that same result, that the same publication that just produced that huge result post-COVID indicates that of the almost 150,000 wildlife watchers, 96 million of them are watching birds. And of the $250 billion spent on wildlife viewing, broadly speaking, across the US annually, $162 billion of that is a consequence of the fact that humans love birds so much. So birds are not just fun things singing in the woods. They're also huge economic drivers across the entire landscape of the US and Canada, and increasingly in the more less developed parts of the world. So birds are big business. And if they need some convincing that birds have hit the mainstream, I couldn't believe seeing this ad while watching last winter's Super Bowl. Let's see if we can make this play all right.
Beautiful, isn't it? Ravens, Seahawks, Eagles. Each year they must follow the path of migration, marking the season's end. It is at this time that we must say goodbye to watching these majestic creatures live. But never fear. They'll be back, as certain as the sun. They always come back. Which is why it's never too early to prepare for the coming season by signing up for NFL Sunday Ticket and YouTube TV, where you can watch every game, every Sunday. Yes, with NFL Sunday Ticket, you can greet the new season as it dawns. Oh, a rookie.
Oh,
Sign up for
rookie.
NFL Sunday Ticket.
If you needed any convincing that the birds have hit the mainstream, there's a good one. Here's another one. Many of you have been around and knowledgeable of the lab of ornithology since the very origin of eBird, before the building was opened in 2003. But what we never could have dreamed at that time when we created this thing. Actually, we did dream it, but we thought we were having just wonderful, miraculous dreams of an impossible future. The rate at which eBird would continue to grow and catch on, so that at this point, I don't know if you can see the numbers, but the number of checklists we're getting per month is now between 1.5 and 2.5 million checklists from individuals all over the planet, with observations now totaling more than a couple of billion observations. Last winter's Great Backyard Bird Count set the record for the total number of species seen in a single weekend, almost 8,000. That's about 80% of the world's birds, reported through 385,000 checklists by well over 500,000 observers around the world in 210 different countries. eBird is an amazing global resource. Here is not a map of the world, but simply a map of the dots where people have sent in information from eBird. As you can see, you can now sort of project why I'm introducing this. We are now gaining information on a daily basis from biological sites literally all over the planet, including some of the most remote places in the world. Why is that important? Before I get to that, I'll just mention that eBird is now available. I'm sure this slide is outdated. As of this slide, there were 54 different languages. You could probably switch to probably 60 by now, because they're constantly adding new languages for people to use around the world. And as a companion to eBird, the Lab of Ornithology developed this incredible app. How many here have Merlin on their phones? Let me ask this question. Does anybody here not have Merlin on your phone? Nobody's willing to admit it. Well, if you have Merlin, you know it's now made to identify literally every species of bird in the world. There are packs for every single country. The Sound ID, which was really a game changer, which we've been working on for more than 10 years, finally came to fruition not much more than a year ago. And as we go through time, we'll be adding more and more species as we get enough samples of those individuals to train the AI systems in there to be able to identify the bird from your phone. And I couldn't resist playing this. This is a naturally generated set of user tributes to Merlin that's just too much fun not to show you if you haven't seen it yet.
So I'm gonna show you how to bird like a pro. And all you need is one app. That app is called Merlin.
It's called Merlin Bird ID.
The Merlin Bird ID app.
Merlin Bird ID.
Merlin.
None of these are from the lab.
Just
This
open
is all
this app
public.
and you hit sound ID. You download like whatever region you live in, and then it'll identify all the birds around you and light up when they sing.
Look it. That was just all in like 5 minutes of me sitting out in my back deck.
This app is now part of my personality. I just left a work meeting, heard birds chirping, hopped in the whip, pulled the app out. House finch.
I'm obsessed. I'm never going to stop using this app. Like, I can't even handle it.
So I'm addicted to this, not in a literal medical sense, but I don't think I could live without it.
I'm addicted to this, so addicted. I'm addicted to this.
My dad sent me this, like, the sound app for birds. And you press play, and it listens to the birds around you, and it tells you what bird it is and what the bird looks like. So now, my ass over here, since I've been using it, thinks I'm like a bird expert.
Okay, so yes, I heard of the Merlin app before. I use it all the time in my backyard. Lots of birds we have caught on it. We got a yellow-throated warbler, I think it was called. We get blue jays, cardinals, white-throated sparrows all the time. And yeah, it's an awesome app.
Hear the birds chirping. What kind of bird is that? My boo identifies it because she got the Merlin app. Is that a black and white warbler? Nah. Think again, the cinnamon colored feathers. It's a Carolina wren.
Love
So
it.
I'm gonna show you how.
So I've got to just take a, as a very, I can't introduce all the people, but just so you know, the groundswell, the huge pulse of work on eBird and on Merlin and on BirdNet, which is an alternate version of Merlin that is agnostic for what kind of sound it's listening to, is a huge team, a growing team of people at the lab headed by these 4 individuals. But there are teams working on software, managing the database, which, as you can imagine, is an enormous job. Project management of a variety of kinds, dealing with the reviewers, of which there are more than 2,000 across the world, the data management team, the Macaulay Library, which is now integrally coupled with eBird to be able to receive images, sounds, and videos from the people around the world that are watching the birds and making their checklists. And finally, this incredible, brilliant status and trends team, brilliant statisticians, AI specialists, who are together working on the rest of the slides, basically, that I'm going to be showing you here in a second. The consequence of their efforts has been that we get to see in near real time the movements of all the species of birds of the world on a weekly basis. That's what we've begun to map. You can go to the eBird science tab and actually go in and watch these yourself. It's sort of like watching fire, you just keep watching it. This is the barn swallow. We're going to mention the barn swallow again in a second. Just a couple of other things, signature advances that have now been made that really get to the question about a bird's role in understanding what's happening with the planet. What we first were able to do is map the birds' occurrences. We then were able to have enough data to be able to map their abundances across their different parts of their range and at different times of the year, such that we could produce these annual cycles. You saw it with the barn swallow. Here's one of my favorite birds, the hooded warbler, breeds in our forests here around Ithaca. There's its summertime breeding range. Clearly, winter's in a very tiny part of Central America. So in terms of conservation, if you're worried about protecting things like hooded warbler, We can use these maps now to pinpoint the places where the bird is either most abundant, which means that we can learn something in that respect, or where it's not occurring or occurring only marginally, so we can study the differences in that. Every single species of bird. So we can generate really accurate maps, range maps like this. This is not your mom's and dad's bird guide map anymore. This is what those maps used to look like. I call them blobs. You can now see for every single species how heterogeneous the distributions are, even of some of our most common birds. And then the big holy grail, which we talked about for years, and as the data accumulated sufficiently over the 20 teens particularly, and as the expertise of our status and trends team began to develop deeply, we began to achieve the long desired use of eBird data across years to be able to understand on a species level basis and at remarkably fine grain how the local population trends are doing. And so now, for a huge number of species worldwide, we can plot the local population trends at 27 by 27 kilometer pixel size. That's extremely fine grained. And so we produce maps of the kind you're seeing here, where the red dots are the hooded warblers, areas where the bird is declining. The blue dots show you areas where the bird is increasing. And so this suddenly opens up this enormous, infinite scaled treasure chest of information, allowing people to begin to study what's going on up here in the Northeast that is causing a otherwise common bird. The big dots mean the bird is common there, but the big red dots mean it's common but declining rapidly at 4, 5, 6% a year. So the information contained in these species by species maps is suddenly burgeoning. I put this map in here particularly because it's my wife's favorite bird, but it's also one of mine. It's an elegant bird that if you've traveled in the summertime to the southeastern US, especially Florida, you know this wonderful swallow-tailed kite. And I'm happy to say that the swallow-tailed kite, both in Central America and in its restricted but growing range in North America, is actually increasing, which is a wonderful story. Talk about increasing. Every single pixel of the map of the bald eagle has been increasing since 2010. Indeed, now we know that there are probably more eagles in the US than there have been for the last 150 years. And it's continuing to grow, shown by this all blue map. What about some of our most abundant birds? We always say that we're actually more interested in the really common birds than we are in the really rare birds, because the common birds have more likelihood of information about things that are going on underneath them, because there are just so many of them that we can get a lot of information about them. So what about this one, our most familiar bird of all? Breeds across the US and Canada, the American robin. And let's look at their annual cycle. It's pretty cool. You can see they're very common across the especially central and eastern US, plus the western part of the US. Oops, I just gave away the answer. Let me, so here's their annual cycle. So migrating north in the spring, breeding across all of North America. Purple is the most abundant, and then down to this widespread range in the winter. So how's our wonderful, familiar North American robin doing? There's the winter distribution. And essentially everywhere, it's showing dramatic declines. The American robin. What about breeding zone? Maybe there's something about how birders deal with birds in the wintertime that make despite the ability of our statisticians, something screwy about reports in the wintertime. There's the same species across its breeding zone. Yes, there are some zones out in the west where the bird is thinly distributed in the intermountain west of Canada, especially, and their dots are blue. But amazingly, once again, where the bird is most common, it is declining most rapidly. We have no idea why. We can hypothesize that it might have a lot to do with the nature of things that we do to our lawns and golf courses and mobile home communities across the US, but there's no specific hypothesis right now that is a believable one for why the American robin, one of our most common and familiar birds, is declining at such a pace. It's not true for all of the common birds of the east and the south. The Carolina wren, which is we're at the northern end of its breeding range here around Ithaca, and the bird is actually increasing here along the northern edge of its range, as well as all across the southeast. So a lot of birds that live in, backyards and woodlots and so on are doing okay, but some of them aren't. This conceivably should be able to tell us, as we hone in on what's going on with those ones that aren't, what we're doing to the ground. And I put this on just to show you that there's every single species of bird has its own map. So there's an enormous amount of information locked up in these trend maps. I'm showing you 6 or 8 of them here. These 6 or 8 are actually just part of a larger tapestry of North American bird distributions, in which we have the trends shown over the last 10 to 15 years. And broadly speaking, there are more than half of these species that are across their range broadly declining. Almost all the remaining birds show mixed areas. So some places they're declining, some places they're stable or increasing. And then, as you've seen, there's a few species that are broadly increasing. Every one of those little maps that you can't barely see from out there is a treasure trove of information about some biology that's going on underneath those species. So we have opportunities galore for studying how the planet is changing underneath these birds. Some really interesting patterns that I'll end the conversation with here that are of particular interest and, in some cases, many cases, concern. This is one of the most interesting contrasts we have, because of course the crows and ravens, very closely related birds, similar ecologically and of course physically. Ravens a little bigger, and the crow is, broadly speaking, declining over its entire range. We suspect that this map in particular is a consequence of West Nile virus, because crows are, as some work done here in Ithaca has shown, crows are unusually susceptible to dying from West Nile virus. So I think that explains the story with the American crow. No understanding yet of what's going on with common ravens, except perhaps that the crows are disappearing. But the raven is increasing over essentially its whole range, including right around here, Ithaca, New York, where it's now a relatively regularly seen bird. It used to be very rare. You've seen this famous fish-eating bird that has done very well over the last generation across the US. But here's another very well-known, very widespread fish-eating bird that is doing the opposite. Something is going on with the great blue heron. Once again, where it is most abundant, it is declining most rapidly. We don't know why. This bird is restricted to wetlands and is restricted to eating fish and other major organisms in wetland systems, and it's not doing well anywhere. We don't notice that typically because they're still pretty common. But look at the map now, mapped over a 15-year period, and we're seeing a signal that we have opportunity to listen to and pay attention to. There's an alarming trend going on with other wetland birds, not just the great blue heron. Red-winged blackbird is, we think, is probably the most abundant bird in North America. And it is, broadly speaking, declining once again. Where it's most common, is declining most rapidly. Its close relative, the yellow-headed blackbird, is a bird of the marshes of the Great Plains and the West, and that bird is declining everywhere. These marsh birds, which are feeding on the wetland, mainly the wetland invertebrates in ponds, marshes, lake shores, and so on, they are declining across the board. One possibility for this, one hypothesis that exists, is that this is a consequence of mercury contamination. And indeed, a study recently was published that shows that today's mostly wetland bird mercury levels are up to 17 times higher than they were when the specimens of those same species were collected 100 years ago. So mercury, which is no friend to humans, may be a culprit in the wetland systems across the board in North America. Aerial insectivores are some of our most popular birds: barn swallows, tree swallows, common nighthawks, cliff swallows in the Midwest and plains especially, all of them declining everywhere. So much so that in Canada, the barn swallow, the familiar barn swallow, is becoming a bird of special concern and about to go on their endangered species list. Something's happening across these whole guilds. This is not just aerial insectivores, it's also true of the grassland birds across North America, Canada, and the US particularly, where it's not just a few places. These are birds that are declining literally at every single place where they occur. And so there's something that is beginning to look systemic about these birds, all of which feed on invertebrates. There's the grassland bird guild as a whole. Now, we can blame some of that on the fact that we go more and more towards horizon to horizon agriculture worldwide. So the habitats are being taken away of these birds. That's one natural and obvious reason why many of these grassland birds might be declining. But combined with some other information, we have to begin wondering, and we are beginning to wonder, whether there's something more systemic. And this is a graph taken out of one of a number of publications over the last 5 to 7 years that are showing that worldwide, the insect populations of the world are crashing. You may have seen a National Geographic magazine about the insect Armageddon a couple of years ago. I have this circled here for those, any of you who's a fly fisherman. I circle for purposes of people who fly fish. The most popular flies, caddisflies, mayflies, stoneflies, are among the most rapidly declining birds. These are insects of fast-moving streams, by and large. So we think that there's a smoking gun appearing, and this one really has a lot of us worried, a lot of people worried around the world. And that is the massive spreading of the use of neonicotinoid pesticides as aids to agricultural productivity. These are pesticides that are systemic in nature. They coat the seeds of a corn or a canola oil plant. The plant grows up containing the pesticide inside it. But these are highly soluble pesticides that end up in the water systems around the world. There was a study not long ago from the Netherlands using citizen science data that showed that as neonicotinoid concentrations go up in the water table, the bird populations were going down with a very high, remarkably high correlation. And guess what? The most common neonic is imidacloprid, which is the thing that you have inside most of your insecticides that you use in your garden. This publication really concerned us several years ago by a famous ecologist, Dan Jansen from the University of Pennsylvania. Took this picture at a nightlight in 2007 at one of his favorite places in Costa Rica. And the publication compares what that particular nightlight sheet had on it in 2007 with the same exact time period in 2019. In desolate, dry forest of Costa Rica. Now I bring up the Brazil and Ecuador and Panama story from earlier because this and a number of other very recent publications looking at air and rainwater, in this particular publication in rural France, showing that 12 different pesticides, including one insecticide, guess which one, were quantified in rainwater. So these pesticides are coming down from the clouds because they're being taken up in a variety of ways and joining the atmosphere in the air and condensing into water droplets all over the world. We have a systemic issue, we think, a smoking gun of a systemic issue underway. And it isn't just imidacloprid and other neonicotinoids. There are PFASs and other things that are now being actually discovered in rainwater, which, if you know anything about the circulation of air around the earth, this makes this stuff a global situation. So those declines that we've been seeing here, one can, in some cases, go to specific causes at that particular habitat, but increasingly there's evidence that we have something going on at the global scale we've never thought about before. And how do we know all this? Because the birds are telling us that there's something happening out there that we should pay attention to, just as we paid attention to DDT when the peregrine falcons were declining and the bald eagles were crashing in the 60s. We realized DDT was poisoning them. Oh, by the way, it was poisoning us too. Mercury poisoned us too. Neonicotinoids poison us too. So I'm going to end just by saying, you know, there's a myriad individual stories out there that are filled with information that are a grist for tons of PhD theses and careers in biology and ornithology. But I want to particularly stress for you the fact that wherever you are, whatever places you know and love and visit regularly, there are countless stories right around you, everywhere you are. All of us tend to have places. Your favorite place is a gold mine of information. And I'll just review that birds are these superb models for nature. They are these amazing environmental indicators. They're the heartbeats of the system, and they sing to us. This is what Molly and I get to look at our particular place, which sometimes looks like this, just east of town. Don't look at this and think about my place. Look at this and think about your place. Everybody, every one of you has one or more places. You can participate in the process that we are continuing to grow right now in understanding this little dot that Carl Sagan wrote about is our home. It's, of course, our place of origin. And for many of us, it's our house of worship. And with the kinds of information that you can gather, and people are gathering now worldwide, we're going to be able to fit in, learn how to fit in with all this grandeur. And it is vital that we not give up. Thank you very much.
We have time for 2 questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yep. One more. Okay. Can everyone hear me? We have time for just 2 questions. So if you can raise your hand, I'll come over and bring the mic to you.
John, you've already answered this question to some extent, but just as an anecdote, we have a farm in central Pennsylvania. I went there last spring and found all the fields dead and red because of the miracle of no-till agriculture. It seemed to me that it was bad for all nature save the earthworms, which apparently are thriving. Any thoughts?
Oh boy, that's a great question, and I'm not at all an expert on no-till agriculture. I know I personally had great conversations with advocates and with disadvocates. It is absolutely true that earthworms, the common annelid earthworm that we see in our yards, that's an introduced earthworm, the thing that's just abundant in every vegetable garden across the U.S. right now. But I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of insight about no-till. I would guess your dead fields out there had some scourge that maybe even an introduced one.
It's based on Roundup, I guess. What, glyphosate?
Glyphosate, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they claim it disappears within a week, but I kind of wonder whether it's in that one place.
Yeah, glyphosate's going. I think its stock is going way down.
We have one last question.
What can you tell me about the search for the ivory-billed woodpecker?
The ivory-billed, the great ivory-billed woodpecker. The most recent interesting news is that there are now several publications about recent evidence that the bird has been encountered, including multiple individuals in northeastern Louisiana. amazingly, not very far from where Arthur Allen and Jim Tanner studied them in the 1930s. And actually not that far from where our reports were in the Arkansas area. So the most concrete thing I can say is that, and I'm happy to say, is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service a couple of years ago proposed to delist it and declare it extinct, and enough evidence came in of a variety of kinds, and comments came in of from a variety of sources that they have indefinitely postponed that action. And in my view, that's the correct thing to do. It might be extinct, as I wrote in my own comments, but there's some good, believable reasons to suspect it might not be extinct. So what's the hurry? Don't declare it extinct now. So far, it's sitting there as an ongoing mystery. Well, I appreciate very much your attention.